A wee bit overexposed, matey. Ow.
Just to let you know, this is actually a condensed review. If you want to see our full review of this camera, you can see it in the cards above or the description below if you want to watch about an hour of content about this camera. For this video, we partnered with Sigma.
So this is what the camera looks like right out of the box. It's very small, very compact. I mean, it is the size of my hand, which is very impressive. And it's not all that thick. Overall, the whole construction just feels solid. There's a lot of metal everywhere. The buttons are also very tactile, and they don't feel cheap. This camera has a full frame sensor, and you can see that huge sensor just crammed into this tiny body, which is kind of impressive to look at. So I'm going to come over to this side over here where we can see there's a microphone jack here. There is a micro HDMI. There are some pins for a handy little extender that you get right here that can slap onto the side. And then up here you have a USB-C where you can record onto a SSD. And before I move on, I just want to mention that this USB-C can be used for charging. However, the camera does have to be off for it to be charged, and you can't charge while recording. So now that we've gone over the physical aspects of the camera, I want to dive into the technical specifications and the price. So let's start out with how much money you have to fork over to Sigma to make this camera yours. And currently the pricing starts at $1,700. Now this is actually a pretty good deal because the specs are impressive. This shoots up to 4K 12-bit Cinema DNG RAW internally. You heard me right. 12-bit RAW internal. Of course, you cannot record onto an SD card because SD cards are not fast enough, so you will need an SSD to record onto. But more on that later. The features in this camera are quite impressive. You can shoot MOV files. They do look very nice. The image quality is very nice in this camera, even when it is not RAW. When you're recording in 4K Cinema DNG, you can record up to 30 frames per second. And if you drop that down to 1080, you can record up to 100 frames per second. More options are unlocked when you record externally. Now that is one thing I need to mention, is that you cannot record compressed RAW internally. It only does uncompressed RAW, which means you're going to have crazy huge files. When recording in MOV, you can record up to 30 FPS in 4K and 120 FPS in 1080p. You can choose whether you record in all-I or long GOP. Noah will talk about the photo features a little more later on.
So yesterday, Leaf and I came down here to these brown yet still beautiful woods to film a video. Well, we were all around the property. That video was released last week. That was about 5 tripod hacks. And most of that was filmed on this camera, this exact setup pretty much. We had it on this tripod, we had an SSD plugged into it, just rubber banded to the tripod, and everything was going smoothly. You know, we were setting up shots kind of like this. I was pulling focus on Leaf, pressing record, you know, just checking the audio levels, the exposure. The one slightly irksome thing besides managing around the SSD sometimes was the screen was a little bit dim and the focus peaking wasn't great, so it would take me a little while, especially if we were awkwardly behind a tree or something, to pull focus, make sure it was in focus, so that we had a usable shot. Then we go inside, we connect the SSD to Leaf's computer, and we take a look at the footage, and half of it is ever so slightly out of focus. It's to the point where we decided it was still usable for the video, just because we were really liked the content that we ended up filming. But that was really frustrating. Now, by popular request, back when this camera was initially released, Sigma recently released the FPL. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But that also has a viewfinder that you can You can use the pins right on here, the side here, to connect a viewfinder, so you don't need to worry about the LCD. Which, you know, yay, I'll pick up the viewfinder, use that, except it's $700. $700, somewhere around there, for a viewfinder just seems like a huge ask. You might as well go with a 7-inch Atomos recorder for that price. So, what's it like filming with this camera in a studio? Well, it's definitely much easier than outside because of that damn LCD screen. What I will say though is if you are filming by yourself, it will be quite a bit of a challenge. You're going to need some kind of external monitor at the very least. You cannot really rely on the autofocus, meaning you need to pull focus manually, and if you don't have an external monitor, you either need a stand-in subject with a very clearly marked spot for where the camera needs to be and where the subject needs to be, or you need to have someone who knows how to pull focus come in and do it for you. Bit of a hassle. The other problem, if you want to call it a problem, is that there isn't a headphone output, so there's not really a good way to monitor your audio, and right now it could be all messed up and we wouldn't even know it. We're actually recording with a separate recorder up there for redundancy, just in case. This camera can also live stream. Currently you're hearing the audio and seeing the video from this camera plugged into my computer via USB-C to USB-A and brought into OBS. We did a full live stream with it, so we had some experience trying to use it, and we had some problems with the audio and its delay. Probably right now there's a good bit of delay between the video you're seeing and the audio you're hearing, and it was a little bit frustrating. When I used this camera in Zoom, it wasn't an issue. Zoom might have some automatic audio syncing technology that OBS doesn't have, but even when we tried manually syncing it with audio delay in OBS, we never got it quite perfect in about the 10 minutes that we had to try to solve the issue. But it is possible to live stream with this camera without a capture card, and it's a very nice 1080p image. Here we see some autofocus tests that we performed, and currently you are watching the footage from the continuous AF, which, as you can see, is hopeless, honestly. As we've mentioned, this camera only has contrast-based autofocus points, and only 49 of them at that, even when we stick the card straight in front of the lens, clearly obstructing it, unless it takes up the entire frame. With the camera automatically choosing where to focus, it's just hopeless and unusable. And here we see the single autofocus, so you will see me pressing the button to focus the camera as the scene changes. And yes, this is a little bit better. You could use this if you are filming yourself and you are going to remain a constant distance away from the camera. So don't expect to be vlogging with this camera or filming yourself in any other way. You need a person behind the camera.
I want to talk about what it is actually like to shoot with this camera. So, for an example of what it's like to shoot, I'm going to try filming my dog. And this is probably one of the most important points I will make. So after shooting my dog for a little bit and my brother playing with him, there are a few things that really stand out. Of course, I had to shoot at f/14, but it's a super sunny day and any camera's gonna have to do that. This actually helped me out in this situation because of the lack of autofocus on this camera. At f/14, I was able to get a lot of the image in focus. And when this camera gets an image in focus, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a great image. However, it can be kind of hard to focus because of this tiny, dim LCD screen on it. And, well, it could be brighter, still the size of it makes it very hard to focus especially fast-moving subjects like a running dog. Also, the focus peaking seems to not be terribly accurate. It just is a little bit off. Anyhow, I love using this camera, but the lack of designated cinema glass that would have a large focus ring for me to use, the lack of a usable LCD for focusing in bright conditions, that's different indoors. Indoors, it's fine. Those two things combined make it very difficult to use this camera when shooting fast-moving subjects or doing the type of shooting that I do, which is one-man show run-and-gun shooting. And none of that's to mention that we have to attach this grip, plug in an SSD. So that's my overall opinion of shooting with this camera. It's a great image when you're able to get a shot in focus, but probably my biggest issue with this camera is the usability in a fast-paced, single-person run-and-gun shoot. There are a few more things that I want to mention about shooting with this camera. And the first one is the excellent dynamic range. When you are shooting in Cinema DNG RAW, the amount of dynamic range you have, especially the amount of flexibility you have with it in post-production, is astonishing. I mean, you can pull back highlights you never thought you'd see again. And it really can help, especially if there's a window in the background or a bright sky in the background of your shot, and you don't want that blown out white look in the background. Now, there is image stabilization in this camera. It's digital image stabilization, so not the best, but I understand why they did not put sensor shift stabilization, because that would increase the size of this camera greatly because it's a full frame sensor.
What about the photo features of this camera? Well, at a first glance, they might seem impressive. It can do something like 18 frames, continuous electronic shutter, because of course it has no mechanical shutter in RAW, except then you find out that that's only for 12 frames, meaning you don't even get a second of continuous shooting, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, even despite that kind of drawback, this really isn't meant to be a photo camera. It should not be treated as a photo camera, and hardly as a hybrid camera. It's really a video-centric camera, and mainly that's because it comes down to the fact that this has no mechanical shutter. Also, just ergonomically, this isn't photo-oriented. It's meant to either be rigged out as a video camera or put into a small or difficult space.
Now that we have gone out and shot with this camera in many different scenarios, we have found that the ergonomics can sometimes be quite irritating, especially that horribly dim LCD screen. So I want to go over what you can realistically expect to be spending when you purchase this camera. So as we said, the camera is $1,700, which is a good deal. If you want to slap on another $200 and get the kit lens, which I highly suggest, then you get a lens with it. And this lens is probably the best kit lens I have ever used. Generally, if you buy the lens separately, it costs about $500. So let's just assume you're spending $1,900 for camera and lens, and that'll get you a good start. However, you're gonna need SSDs to record RAW video. I'm assuming you're buying this camera for the RAW video capabilities. So that will be a few $100s. I would say you're going to want to spend about $300 to $400 in SSDs so you get plenty of storage space for all that RAW video. As we mentioned, at this camera's max record setting, you only get about 50 minutes on a terabyte of storage. So you're going to want a good $400 worth of SSDs. So that brings our grand total up to $2,300. Now, you're also going to want a monitor because that screen is basically useless outside on a sunny day. So a monitor, a good one, 4K monitor, that's going to run you anywhere from $300 to $500. So now for all the newbies out there, when I say 4K monitor, I mean it supports a 4K input. The screen's actually not 4K because that doesn't really matter. What you just want is a good screen that you can pull focus on. So getting that monitor with a 4K input, let's just say you go for one that's $300. Well, now you're looking at $2,600. And for the capabilities, I think that's still a really good deal for what you're getting. Now, we could go another route, and you could forget the SSDs, forget the monitor, and go straight for something like an Atomos Ninja 5. An external recorder will allow you to unlock a few more recording features and settings like frame rates in RAW video. And something like the Atomos Ninja 5 is a great low-end recorder that'll give you plenty of capabilities. So we take that, that's about $500, we add that to our $1,900, we're at $2,400 here. Also, you're going to need some sort of storage device, and again, you're going to need about $400 worth of SSDs, so that's getting up around $3,000. Again, for $3,000, the capabilities that you would unlock with an external recorder and the SSDs in this camera is just incredible. Another thing you might want to consider is some sort of stabilization device, because this camera does not have any in-body image stabilization other than the electronic stabilization, which I generally would advise not using. So depending on what you already own and what you would be doing with this camera, you could be spending anywhere from $2,500 to $3,500 realistically. However, I wouldn't let this scare you away because that is still excellent value for the features that you are getting with this camera.
Okay, so now you are either watching one of two things. Either you are watching the condensed version of this discussion in the actual review video of the FP, or you are watching the full discussion that we are about to have, which we uploaded as a separate video to YouTube, and who knows how long that is. It may end up being an hour even.
Yes, the last segment where I was talking about how it is to shoot with this camera in the real world, for me, my experience with it. And this is where we kind of ran into the contradiction that this camera is. So it's primarily marketed towards a lower end, like a lower end market, the average consumer, which to me doesn't make sense for a few reasons, and then makes sense for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to go over why they'd market it towards your average consumer. One, its price. It's $1,700. That's cheap. Two, it can live stream. That's a great feature in a camera. Three, it shoots RAW for cheap. So right there, you're like, wow, I get this camera that shoots RAW for cheap, and I can live stream with it. And that's great for lower budget, YouTubers. But then comes the problem where there's no compressed RAW. And uncompressed RAW, which is what this camera shoots, are absolutely enormous files. A terabyte can be filled up with just like 40 to 50 minutes of recording at its highest record setting. So with no compressed RAW, you're running into these massive file sizes that are just... Yes, you can edit it on a fairly average computer, but the amount of storage you need and the amount of money it costs to store this is through the roof. So it ends up turning out to be like a $3,000 camera once you consider the expense of recording all that data. And then you're like, is this really the best option for a lower end consumer? Because the idea of RAW is nice, but when it's uncompressed, doesn't make sense to me. So I will have to say here, if this camera excels in one particular area, in my opinion, and that is being a secondary camera in a larger budget shoot, or being a primary camera. It definitely could be in a higher budget production where you are actually using that 12-bit DNG RAW, and you have proper stabilization equipment, you have float head tripods, you have nice gimbals, all this other equipment necessary, plus external recorders to fully get the true capabilities out of this camera, where you can get an image that's equivalent to some $6, $7, even $8,000 cinema cameras off of this tiny body. It's just you need to rig it out, so it ends up costing like $3,000 to $4,000, which is fine, considering you're still chopping the price in half from these higher end cinema cameras to get a similar image. But I don't see this as a consumer level camera.
Yeah. And when we say higher budget, we don't necessarily mean a high budget professional movie where they're going to be spending millions, of course.
No, I'm talking where you might have a few grand.
Yeah. Say you have $5,000 spent on equipment for a shoot, or just for your style of shooting. Now, we've been kind of harping on this camera quite a bit. In the review, we were nitpicking on these little things. We've been complaining about the LCD, and we're talking about how it just doesn't make sense for the market. But at the end of the day, is it a good camera? Yeah. Is it an amazing image? Yeah. And did it inspire us to create awesome content? Very much so. It was extremely exciting to have a new camera in hand, and maybe that was just because we don't use that much new gear all the time. But we both went out and we just shot whatever we saw, whatever we thought could make good shots, even if it was just boring focus pulls of moss. And we enjoyed doing it. So if you want to work with D&G,
this is the camera for you.
You think that this camera's form factor makes sense, you don't mind a couple $100 for a lens with decent focus ring for focus pulling, and SSDs, did I mention that? Then this camera definitely does make sense for you. Compared to the competition, I don't know. It's a personal choice, of course.
I think.
And again, we love this camera. We just think it's a little confusing to us because we're not exactly sure what it's trying to do. Is it trying to be a B camera for professionals who want a small camera to hook onto a car or to a chest mount? Or is it aimed at consumers as a stepping stone for a RAW?
Yeah, and so definitely an amazing camera, high fidelity images, and great specifications. Just make sure that it's right for you, because it's a confusing camera.